Good afternoon and welcome all to the conference Arab Jews, Jews of Islam, Mizrahim or Sephardim, Jews from Arab lands in Israel. This conference is co-organized by American University Center for Israel Studies and the Department of World Languages and Cultures. We greatly appreciate the support of the Knapp Family Foundation that funded this conference and made it possible. I would also like to thank Ms. Laura Cutler, Managing Director, Center for Israel Studies, for her hard work on logistics for this conference, and Mr. Frank Katzir, Director of Sephardic Heritage International DC, for providing us with ma'amul and Moroccan cookies for this event. The historical experience of Arab Jews or Mizrahim in Israel is yet to receive the attention it deserves in academia and beyond. Both Professor Michael Brenner and I are pleased to hold the first academic conference on this topic in our university and hope that it will contribute to a better understanding of this experience. I take this opportunity to thank our speakers for coming to our campus to share with us their specialist knowledge and analysis. Before we start, I would like to make a few cursory remarks about the topic that struck me as a student of the pre-modern Islamic world. The identity questions of Arab Jews /Mizrahim /Sephardim were created by the modern world and its shaping mechanisms, particularly nationalism, colonialism, and modernization. In the pre-modern Islamic world, one's identity, social belonging, and rhythm of life were mainly related to one's religious community. Remarkably, before Islam, in pre-Islamic Arabia, things have been different. Arab population was mostly pagan, but some Arab tribes converted to Judaism, as described by medieval Muslim and Jewish sources, and others embraced Christianity. The surviving cultural product and manifestation of Arabian Jews is Arabic poetry, and it is often indistinguishable in its content and style and the social values it reveals from poetry of pagan or Christian Arabs. Rather than religion, the poems of Arab Jewish poets of pre-Islamic Arabia emphasize clan and tribe and their merits, in a way which is very typical and representative of tribal Arabian society of that period. The full integration of Jews in wider Arab society in pre-Islamic Arabia, as reflected in this poetry and the values it promotes, has been a model for those Jews who sought to recreate it in the medieval Islamic period, and even more so in the first half of the 20th century. During the Nahda, the cultural Arab revival of the late 19th century, and early 20th century, homeland, Arabic cultural heritage and language were raised above religion as a collective mark of belonging, and sectarianism, ta'ifiyya, was rejected by notable intellectuals. A famous motto of the era was Adin lillah wal watan lil jami'. Religion belongs to God and the homeland to all. Saad al-Husri's influential theory of Arab nationalism pointed to language and common history as the two pillars of nationalism. According to him, those who spoke Arabic were Arabs. This was the pluralist cultural climate that created what the scholar Reuven Sneer called the Baghdad Spring of the 1920s and 1930s in Iraq, which inspired Iraqi Jews and made them believe in their place in society as Iraqis and Arabs. This vision failed, but the marks of the past on the present cannot be completely erased. This conference will explore the ways Mizrahim in Israel sought to reconnect with their past, their place in Israeli society, and their fight against discrimination. I am pleased to turn now to Professor Brenner, who will moderate our first panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Erez, for this introduction. It's nice to see a lot of people and students interested in this topic. And it's a special pleasure for me and an honor for me to organize this conference together with my esteemed colleague Erez Naaman. So special thanks to Professor Naaman. And of course, as he already said, Laura Cutler for making this possible. I'll be very brief in my introduction because we want to have time for your questions. So I'll just introduce our speakers before their turn. And we will have about 20 minutes for each speaker. We will have the Q&A after the two presentations. Our first speaker is Caroline Kallenberg. She is a visiting assistant professor in history and Israel Institute faculty fellow at the University of Virginia. Her research and her teaching focuses on the history of Jews of the Middle East, on Israel-Palestine, on gender issues. She's the author of several scholarly articles, including New Arab Maids, Domestic Work, New Arab Women, and National Memory in British Mandate Palestine, as well as the Star of David in a Cedar Tree, Jewish Students and Zionism at the American University of Beirut. Quite interesting topics. And she will talk to us, she will give our first lecture today. And the topic is The Girl with a Bomb in Her Basket, Mizrahi Jewish Participation in Mandatory Palestine's Jewish Underground. Caroline, please.
All right. Can you all hear me? Yeah. That's all right. That's good. All right. Well, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to Erez and Laura for hosting this conference. It's really exciting to be talking about this topic. I'll speak for about 20 minutes, and what I'm going to speak about today is Mizrahi Jewish participation in Mandatory Palestine's Jewish Underground. I want to start by setting a scene. In Jerusalem in June 1939, the city is really abuzz. Probably many of you have been to Jerusalem and you know on Fridays it's hopping with Jews who are going to the markets to get their last preparations for Shabbat. It's filled with Muslims who are going to the Old City for prayer. At the time in 1939, there were hawkers who were hawking newspapers with headlines about Hitler trying to take over Europe or planning to. And at the Jerusalem Central Prison here, which is in the Russian compound, so maybe you've been there in the center of the city, it was visiting day for Palestinians. So there was a group of dozens of Palestinian Arabs who were lining up to visit their relatives in prison. Now, on the outer skirts of the Russian compound, there was a Palestinian boy who was no more than about 12 years old. And he had just finished his job, which was selling bread to people coming in. When a woman came up to him and said, "I have another job for you. Could you please carry my basket? I'm going up to the prison. I'm going to visit my brother, and I have some fruits and vegetables and olives in my basket, and it's kind of heavy for me." He says, "Why not? This is another job." And so they go up the hill to the prison together. But on the way, this boy feels like there's something strange about this woman and her basket. The first thing is that although she speaks Arabic, she says, "Yahui, can you help me?" She speaks Arabic fluently. Something feels a little bit off. It's not exactly Palestinian Arabic, it's more like Egyptian Arabic, he says. The second thing is that the basket is quite heavy for the contents that she said was in it, those fruits and vegetables, the olives and bread. And the third thing is that the bread that is peeking out of the basket, this boy will later recall, is Jewish bread rather than Arab bread. Nevertheless, he doesn't say anything to the woman. and they part ways at the prison. But that's when he decides to go up to an Arab officer and say, there's something a little bit strange about this woman. The Arab officer goes with other British officers up to the woman, and after some back and forth, they make her empty her basket, and underneath the vegetables and the olives and the fruits and the bread is a bomb that's going to go off in just a few minutes. And if it did go off, it would have killed dozens of those Palestinians waiting to see their relatives in prison. Now, it wasn't until they took this woman to the police station. She looked like any other Muslim woman at the time. She had her hair covered, she had a black dress on, but they realized at the time in the police station that she was actually a Jewish woman. Her name was Rachel Habshush, later Ohevet Ami, and she was the daughter of Yemeni and Moroccan Jewish parents. And on that day, she was not going to visit her brother in prison, but in fact, she was going to be carrying out an operation for the Irgun Tzva'i Leumi, which I'll refer to as the Irgun, the revisionist paramilitary group in Palestine. Now, news of this event made headlines within Palestine and even outside of Palestine. Today, Rachel Habshush is not very well known, even among historians, but at the time, her act marked many firsts. The British characterized Rachel's act as the first time they had clear evidence that the source of recent bombs in Jerusalem were from Jewish sources. The revisionists celebrated Habshush as one of the first Jewish women to carry out an attack for the Irgun, and she would certainly be celebrated for years in inspiring other Jews to join the Irgun. And she would also be the first woman sentenced to prison for life under the British emergency regulations. I think this case for historians also brings up a lot of questions that are at the center of Middle Eastern history. The first thing is that Habshush was an Arabic-speaking Jew, and so she raises the question, can you be both Jewish and Arab? And I know this is a question we're certainly going to talk about a lot in today's conference. The second thing is that her parents, who had come to Palestine, as I mentioned, from Yemen and Morocco, were native to the broader Middle East region, we could say, and yet they very much aligned themselves with Zionism, the settler movement. So can you be both a native and a settler? The third thing is that Habshush on that day went to the central prison in order to target Palestinian civilians, yet for the cause of national liberation, which begs the question, who is a terrorist and who is a freedom fighter? There's also another component to Rachel Habshush's story that I'm going to focus on, which is the fact of Mizrahi Jewish participation in the Irgun, as I mentioned, and in general in the Irgun and Lehi, two paramilitary organizations that were affiliated with the revisionist and right-wing, generally, Zionism. So when we talk about the Jewish underground, maybe I will take this. When we talk about the Jewish underground, we're referring to different paramilitary groups in Palestine in the 1930s and 1940s. The mainstream and by far the largest group was the Haganah, and the offshoots of that were the Irgun and Lehi. Now, the Irgun and Lehi, in general, we could say, had a goal of conquering the broader Eretz Yisrael, pictured here, through force if necessary, force against the British and force against the Palestinians. They were well known for some of their more spectacular acts of terrorism, which some historians would argue actually helped push the British out and make room for the Israeli state in 1948. Mizrahi Jews, and I'll refer here to Mizrahi Jews as all what we can say Eastern Jews or Jews from the broader Middle East region, By 1936, they were only about a fourth of the Jewish population in Palestine, and they were far more underrepresented in most Zionist institutions, like the Haganah, like the mainstream Labor Party. And yet, what's interesting is that they were overrepresented, at least in the 1940s, in the Irgun and Lehi, which begs the question of why. Why were Mizrahi Jews, youth in particular, attracted to joining the Irgun and Lehi, and why, from the side of particularly the Ashkenazi leadership of these organizations, why were they recruiting Mizrahi Jews? So that's what we'll try to answer through the story of Rachel Habshush. Now, this is a picture of the Habshush family. This over here is Rachel from the 1930s. Rachel's mother, Eliza, immigrated to Palestine when she was only about 2 years old, and she came from Morocco with her family in the late 1890s. Her father, Nisim Habshush, came from Yemen, also in the late 1890s, with his sister. They had been orphaned with his sister, Naomi. Now, when Eliza and Nisim came to Palestine, as many of us know, Palestine was under Ottoman rule. It was a vast majority of its residents were Muslim and Arabic speaking, with only a small Jewish minority. But by the time they came in the 1890s, there was the beginning of Zionist settlement, particularly from Eastern Europe. Now, by the time Rachel Habshush, or Rachel Habshush, was born in the 1920s, things looked a little different, actually a lot different. Palestine was newly under British rule. They conquered it in 1917, 1918 at the end of World War I. And the British, as many of us know, supported Zionism, offered support for the Jewish national home in the Balfour Declaration. They supported, at least in the 1920s and 1930s, mass Jewish immigration, particularly from Europe. And much of this Zionist activity led to reactions from Palestinians, and we see the rise of Palestinian nationalism that's fighting both against Zionism and also against the British. And here, as we know, we see the beginnings, or at least the growth, of ethno-national violence that continues very much today. Now, there were many instances of Jewish-Arab violence at the time, but one of the main ones, and certainly relevant to our story, is in 1929. There were riots all across the country. The Israeli historian Hillel Cohen does a wonderful job analyzing these riots throughout the country. We will focus on the city of Hebron, where it's very clear what happened. Arabs attacked the minority Jewish community and left about 60 or more than 60 Jews dead, and the rest of the community ended up fleeing Hebron at the time. This is also known as the Hebron Massacre. Now, many Palestinians at the time, and even in memoirs until today, will say that this Hebron massacre, the Palestinians attacked specifically Zionist homes, that is, the newcomers, particularly Eastern European Jews who were trying to bring in Zionist ideas. They didn't have any problem with the old Yishuv, especially Sephardi and Mizrahi communities that they had been neighbors with and they had peaceful relationships with. Now, it's true that the majority of the victims did come from Ashkenazi homes, but there were also victims who were Mizrahi Jews, and one of those Jews was a man named Yitzchak Abu Hanna, who had immigrated to Palestine from Morocco. He was about 70 years old, and he spent most of his time, we know, at the Sephardic synagogue in Hebron. Now, in 1929, in this August riots, he was brutally tied to a door and tortured, and he died. He's relevant to our story because Yitzchak Abu Hanna was Rachel Habshush's maternal grandfather. And Rachel Habshush and her family would later mention the violence from 1929 as a motive for their own violence 10 years later in 1939. This was not only a story of Rachel Habshush, but actually many Mizrahi Jews, as Hillel Cohen documents, would react to the 1929 violence by joining Zionist institutions, realizing that just because they spoke Arabic or they wore a fez on their head, that they were going to be protected from Palestinian violence. They realized that they would want to join these irguns, or these organizations, or they were forced to. Now, in the 1930s, we have the establishment of the irgun, broken off from the Haganah. And from the beginning, and certainly later on we see more involvement from Mizrahi Jews, but from the beginning we see involvement from Mizrahi youth. So I think it's worth stopping here to ask, why might Mizrahi youth be attracted to the irgun rather than the mainstream Haganah? One reason that comes up in some memoirs is that there was discrimination against Mizrahi Jews for being too Arab or for having different languages or tastes or customs from the establishment yishuv, from the Haganah, from the Labor Party, etc. We also see in memoirs a discussion of Mizrahi youth's desire for inclusion, and particularly the idea of like a family social group that's promoted by the irgun. This is particularly relevant because at the time, many Mizrahi youth were living in lower socioeconomic conditions. Many had to, for example, leave school to take up work. And so this kind of social group provided a family or a sort of inclusive atmosphere. There was also the fact that while I mentioned many Mizrahi youth were discriminated against for things like their parents' Arabic language or what their parents wore, that they came from the Middle East, in the irgun, they recognized that they could actually leverage their Arabness for the special role, as we see Habshush does, of disguise, of carrying out attacks in specifically Palestinian areas, disguising themselves as shoe shiners or peddlers, that they could actually perform these roles. And Habshush herself very much acknowledges this. She says, she was chosen for the task because I knew the Arabic language well, and it was easy to consider me an Arab woman. Now, another key moment of violence in Palestine or pre-1948 Israel was the 1936 to 1939 Palestinian revolt. This was a huge revolt, and I'm glad it's increasingly getting historical attention. It was primarily aimed against the British as an anti-colonial revolt, but the Palestinians also targeted Jewish communities. Now, in response to the revolt, most of the Zionist institutions said, we're going to institute a policy of restraint. That is, we're going to kind of let the Palestinians and the British fight it out. We're going to, meanwhile, grow our economy, grow our paramilitary organizations. Yet the irgun rejected this idea. They said, wait a sec, if our communities are being attacked, we need to fight back. We need to take revenge. And it's within this context that we come back to Rachel Habshush's bombing in June 1939. Now, as I said, even though Rachel Habshush is not well known in Israeli or certainly not foreign media today, it was a big deal and it made headlines across the different language newspapers, and her trial did in particular. Her trial is really interesting, and I'm happy to talk about the kind of what exactly goes on because it's something that I really find fascinating. But basically, after the trial, she's sentenced to life in prison. She goes to the Bethlehem Women's Prison, where many subsequent irgun members, women, will go. In prison, she's visited by the likes of Menachem Begin, as well as major Zionist women's organizations. She keeps a diary, which I'm still working through. Thankfully, someone did the wonderful job of typing it up. But in the diary, she talks about things like Jabotinsky's death, how sad she is about it. She talks a little bit about what life is like in prison, but also what's going on outside of the prison when the Irgun and Lehi are particularly ramping up their activities now against the British. Maybe some of you, I'm sure, know of the King David hotel bombing or the assassination of Lord Moyne in Cairo. These were some of the acts. Now, Habshush herself in prison is very interesting because even though she used, for example, her Arabic to carry out or attempt to carry out that attack, she asserts herself as a Hebrew woman in prison, and she refuses to speak Arabic, even when she has visitors coming and there's a guard on duty who only speaks Arabic. So, for example, on one occasion, the prison warden said, "I don't understand. At home you speak Arabic, and your father's Arabic is better than his Hebrew." Rachel replies, "I have many things at home that I don't have here. Here, I am willing to speak and will speak only one language, Hebrew." Rachel is actually lucky because she's released in 1945 after 7 years. At the end of World War II, the British do some pardoning of many people, including Rachel Habshush. And 3 years later, as we know, is the creation of the State of Israel and the birth of the Palestinian refugee crisis. Now, in concluding, I want to talk a little bit about the broader significance of this research. Why does it matter? The first thing is that, in general, although maybe not at this conference because we're focusing on Mizrahi Jews, but in general, Zionism is understood, no matter your political leanings, as a European Jewish movement, a movement that is certainly begins in Europe, and you can look and see most of its leaders are in fact European Jews. And yet, even in the pre-1948 period, before the mass Jewish, Mizrahi Jewish immigration to Israel, we have Mizrahi Jews participating as translators, as in-between, as mediators in land sales between Palestinians and Jews, as well as foot soldiers in organizations like the Irgun, the Haganah, and Lehi. The second thing is, if we think broadly about where this idea of Jews versus Arabs come from, I think actually Mizrahi Jews are central to that. In the late Ottoman period, many historians will characterize Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews as somehow in-between figures, as mediators, as a bridge between Palestinian Arabs on the one hand and the new Yishuv, mostly Ashkenazim, on the other. But what we have in the Mandate period, we see that Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews either choose to very much align with the new Yishuv, or they're forced to from the violence that I mentioned, like in 1929. And in doing so, I think they help to create this Jewish versus Arab border that becomes very solidified through continuous acts in the post-state period. The third thing is that I come from a background in Middle Eastern history, and in Middle Eastern studies, we talk a lot about Palestine as a classic case of settler colonialism, a case of Jewish settlers from Europe versus Palestinian locals or natives. And I think this very much makes sense as a paradigm, but when we focus on Mizrahi Jews, it complicates it because, as we've seen, Jews like Habshush are both native or local as well as part of a settler movement. So we can consider them local settlers. The last thing I'll do is just offer a little epilogue. What happens to Habshush and her peers? Many of the Mizrahi and Ashkenazi members of the Irgun and Lehi become prominent in politics. Some of you may know Geula Cohen, Menachem Begin, and Yitzchak Shamir, all of whom were in those Irgun and Lehi. As for Rachel Habshush, she doesn't become prominent in politics. After the State of Israel is created, she marries, she has 3 children, she talks about her life as a housewife in Petach Tikva, and yet she is called up on occasion back into the public sphere. Here we see her pictured at receiving the coffins of Vladimir and his wife Joanna Jabotinsky's coffins in Israel in the 1960s. And we can see in this image Rachel Habshush in the center in a sea of men, And in her hands this time, what she's carrying is flowers for the casket rather than a bomb in her basket. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. I think that was a really fascinating beginning, which opens up a lot of questions. Keep them for the moment. We'll hear the second talk, and then don't forget the questions, though, to Caroline. Our next speaker is Shoshana Madmoni Gerber, who is an associate professor of communication and journalism at Suffolk University in Boston. She earned her PhD. Okay, עוד רגע אחד. She earned her PhD in communication from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And she also worked as a journalist for many years, covering also the case of the Yemenite babies, which is something she covered in her research as well. For example, in her book, Israel and Media and the Framing of Internal Conflicts, the Yemenite Babies Affair, which was published in 2009. And that is also the topic of her talk today, From Mainstream to Social Media, the Narrative of the Kidnapped Babies Affair and the Fight for Memories and Justice.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for inviting me, Erez, Michael. I want to open my presentation with the testimony of Naomi Gavra. Naomi's child, Zion, was snatched away from her arms in Camp En Shemer, which was one of the largest absorption, what we call, or ma'barot in Hebrew, that accepted the Olim back in 1949. This scenario, while happened in some cases, was not the most common one, as in most cases, the babies were taking from what was called baby houses or other recovery centers when their parents, or hospitals, when the parents were not there. So I want to let Naomi speak first. Can we turn the loud switch? So this is in Hebrew. It's very short, but this is a relatively to anybody who's not recognizing them. Okay. Can you hear me? She was on her way from the hospital in Haifa. A few days before, she gave birth, Naomi, to her son, Zion. It was in the winter of 1949 in En Shemer camp. What kind of a boy he was, Zion? He was sweet. He looked like my father-in-law, the old guy. Do you still miss him? Even if I miss him, what can I do? Are they going to give him back to me? Even if he will, he wouldn't know me, but I still want to feel good to kiss him and to tell him, you're my son, you're my son. Zion was in this baby house like the rest of the babies, and she was allowed to nurse him 3 times a day. One night, at the end of the nursing, she stayed with a Yemeni caregiver named Bracha. She had no idea about what was going to happen. It was 8 at night. All of a sudden, there were 3 of them, 2 women and a man. And he had a beard to here, and he was bald. And the women were maybe 40, 45 years old. And they came in, and they spoke Yiddish, and they took babies. What do you mean? They took babies. It was a room, in a room, in a room. And I said, Bracha, I see that they're taking their babies. Where are they taking them? She said, believe me, I don't know. And I said, well, ask them. And she said, well, they're speaking Yiddish. I don't understand. And I said, well, ask them in Hebrew. So she said, where are you taking the babies? And they said, to a doctor in Ber Yaakov. When will you give them back? A week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So they left, and I saw they left with 14 babies. I saw that with my eye, and I said, okay, they will leave, and I will take my baby and run. All of a sudden, the two came back, and they said, give us your baby, and I said, no. They said, give us your baby, and I held him like that. One of them took my arms like that. The other one took the baby, and they ran. And I chased them. I didn't even know what to do. And I ran like from here to that corner. I don't think they were Jewish. That's actually important. You don't believe they were Jews? No. It's what kind of a heart is that? To kidnap a baby from his mother's hands. It's horrible.
ועדת שלגי שחקרה את היעלמותם של ילדי תימן לא ידעה לומר מה קרה לבנה.
What happened to her son? This testimony was part of a special investigation of the program Uvda that aired back in 1996, February of 1996. And full disclosure, I was part of the investigative team when I was working as a journalist at the time. It is part of what I define in my work as a more alternative, more balanced discourse about this affair. If anything, it illustrates everything that was missing from the mainstream media discourse. So just to give you a little, I don't have a lot of time to get into the historical facts, but just a little bit so that you understand. We're talking about the time that is known in Israel as mass immigration. The state is airlifting 50,000 Jews from Yemen. During this time, when they're coming into the different absorption camps around the country, or ma'abarot, there is a clear policy that's instated to separate babies from their parents, from their families. And the official excuse that is given to them is that since the parents are housed in tin houses and tents, that it would be better for the babies to be in a stone house that was called a baby house. And exactly as you saw in this testimony, the parents are allowed to go nurse, but I just want you to understand that at the moment that there is a policy instead of separating children from the parents are losing their power over the children, and the state can do what it wants. And what happened in most cases, the typical scenario was that the baby would be declared ill, taken to the hospital without parents' knowledge or consent. Some that said that they objected to giving their child said that they were taken from them forcefully. And then they would disappear from the hospitals or from the recovery centers around the country. At the same time, in testimonies, many nurses said that the Yemenites just didn't care about their children. Just so you know a little bit about what the country did over the years, it established 3 commissions, and always in response to the outcry and immense pressure from the Yemeni community. So the first one was in 1967, a short one, then Shalgi Commission in 1988. Both of them were inquiry commissions only, and it's not semantics. They did not have power to subpoena, and basically their investigation was a joke. And then the last one was the only investigative commission following Rabbi Meshulam's protest. To those of you who are, I'll answer questions if you have about this, but since the presentation is short. All 3 commissions combined heard 1,053 cases. A more recent study by Nathan Schifris documents over 2,000 cases. Many activists say that the number is even higher. The state still insists that the overwhelming majority of them died, and only 69 are disappeared and 5 that they found. As a media scholar, I'm interested in questions of media representation and the role of power and ideology in the discourse that they advanced. So what I did in my work, I examined the narratives that were produced by the media over 6 decades, and I was puzzled as a reporter by the lack of a greater interest in this story. Overall, I found a discourse that was mostly aligned with the government version of event instead of challenging it. A media system that acted mostly as a defender of the status quo rather than a watchdog of democracy and justice. As Stuart Hall reminds us, every regime of representation is a regime of power. And the purpose of power is to intervene, to absolutely fix the meaning in order to always maintain its upper hand. So by privileging state authorities' accounts, silencing dissenters, and by forcefully rejecting calls for public investigation, the media were instrumental in shaping the meaning and the public response to this affair. In other words, this massive silencing over time and lack of official acknowledgement still would not have been possible without the media's full cooperation. So what I want to do is quickly share with you just a few of the themes that I located in the media coverage, and then tell you a little bit about what changed since the emergence of social media in the last, let's say, 8 years. So the first thing that I want to talk about is connecting the public denial of this affair to the Zionist narrative. So with the exception of Ha'olam Hazeh back in 1967 and some articles in Haaretz and Ha'ir, and even that, if you'll have questions, it's a little more complex, and I'm happy to elaborate later in the question, but some good articles in the 90s, but aside of those places, inquiry into the allegation of kidnapping was nearly non-existent. Since the mid-60s, after the affair became more publicly recognized, the dominant theme was primarily in the form of questioning the very existence of the affair, especially noteworthy where both the level of denial and the public rejection of attempt to discuss the kidnapping as part of the overall racist attitude towards Mizrahim. This despite hundreds of testimonies of parents, including mothers who testified that their babies were physically kidnapped from their hands, such as Naomi Gavra that we just heard, but we have more stories like that. Like Miriam Ovadia, and despite clear cases such as Miriam Shuker was kidnapped and given to adoption, all the while her father David was looking for her all over the country. Starting with the first articles in the 60s, writers were eager to dismiss claims of kidnappings. Others quoted authority figures framing the affair as wild imagination. And this is something, to those of you who know a little bit about the media discourse about Mizrahim, this fit perfectly into the narrative that we're talking about people with wild imagination. All the while, Yemeni families and activists seeking further investigation and demanding answers say they were silenced. One noted activist, Rafi Shubeli, who was very instrumental in tracking and documenting this affair, said to me in an interview, there was a discourse in the media about us, but without us. To establish this view, the press mainly relied on sources such as absorption camp doctors and nurses and other caregivers that were unequivocally denying wrongdoing, despite a lack of corroborating evidence, not to mention that a proper investigation would have considered them to be suspects. The head of Rambam Hospital in Haifa, for instance, said, and I quote, "Despite the fact that I didn't work in the hospital at the time, I can guarantee that no child was released from the hospital not to his legal parents." And this kind of an answer, for example, is remaining unchallenged, like the journalists have not heard about a follow-up question. Others dismissed all calls for investigation, saying, quote, "All people working in the camps, with no exception, were honest people." Or another headline, "No child was ever released from the hospital without identification," which of course was not true, because then later on nurses testified that they let children go with no identification, one of the head nurses. Another important example is the show Mabat Sheni that was broadcast no less than 3 times, once in 1986 when television channel 1 was the very authoritative voice in Israel, then in 1996 together at the same week as this clip that I just showed you, and set the public tone for accepting the state's version of event. It was also greatly supported by the press that published headlines such as, "Just not another investigative committee," which is peculiar, really, that a media system is objecting to investigation. And it cited the welfare of the children as the reason. So I'm sure those of you who know a little bit about other affairs, this sounds familiar. So this begs the question, why would a news organization reject calls for investigation? One answer is that it threatens the threat that it poses to the Zionist master narrative. It deconstructs it completely, especially as Shochat argues, the notion that Mizrahim were rescued out of their primitive condition. And why the rationale of the Jews as victims is often used to justify state aggression for defense reasons, it is directly contradicted by the story. The second theme that I want to mention is the reinforcement of racial stereotypes, which was prevalent in the media in many narratives when this issue was mentioned at all. So to use Stuart Hall's framework, the discourse of this affair represents a classic example of what he terms the discourse of the West and the rest, emphasizing the inferiority of the East and always, as Said noted, in relation to European superiority. Yemenite parents were often shown as primitive at best incapable of caring for themselves and their children properly, and at worst, as not even caring if a child lived or died. One article, for example, in Davar from '66 described the Yemeni immigrants as, and I'm quoting, peeking through the window and seeing for the first time how to bathe a baby and how to change a baby's diaper. And of course, a description like that is easy to accept when you're already thinking that the level of hygiene within this population is horrible and that they never bathed in Yemen. Another quoted a nurse saying that Yemeni parents had a cavalier attitude towards the death of a child. And I quote, if a child died in the tent, they would say, God give and God take. From this perception, the road to thinking that they were unfit parents is, of course, very short. Or to use Entman's term, these preconceived notions primed audiences to have a specific attitude towards this affair, and the process of both priming and framing affects not only the definition of the problem, but and I quote Entman here, but a moral judgment and a remedy promotion. So it's not surprising that we are still, even in this year, so far from acknowledgement. These racist sentiments were also echoed during nurses' testimonies to the commission and the press in the mid-90s. Maybe we did them a favor, said 92-year-old Ahuva Goldfarb to me in an interview back in '95. Another head nurse, Sonia Milstein, told the commission and the media that the Yemenite parents, and I quote, were not interested in their children. She also shocked the judge when during her testimony she called the babies carcasses and packages. And when asked if she could identify with the parents' pain, she said, oh, after 40 years, I would just be happy that my child got a good education. And the last thing that I want to mention is the framing of this affair. So most importantly, the main role of the media was in framing this narrative as a Yemenite problem. This is the heart of what Entman defines as a framing process. The title, The Yemenite Children Affair, served as a substantial barrier that prevented a more complex understanding of the issue and a wider call for action. This framing process not only maintained the perception that this affair was a Yemenite problem, but also the perception that the Yemenite people were the problem, thus never transforming the discourse to questions of state responsibility. In contrast, for example, I don't know how many of you know about the story of Yossele Schumacher from the 60s, the Haredi boy that was kidnapped by his grandparents, and the entire state, the government, and even the Mossad got involved until he was brought back to his parents. No effort was too big to save one boy, while hundreds of families and parents were not worthy of a fraction of this sympathy or willingness to fight. So what we need to ask ourselves is really why, as a society, we sympathize with one pain and not another. Why hundreds of Yemenite families are still far from getting the answers that they deserve. So what have changed since 2014? A new wave of activism has emerged online, not only by younger activists, but also by veteran activists who utilize social media to establish their protests. Through their online presence, all the organizations contribute greatly to what can be marked as an increased visibility of Mizrahim in the mainstream media, as well as a change in the public perception about this affair. One activist described the power of social media first and foremost as a tool that is allowing activists to skip the middleman and to bypass state institutions. Most notably, much of the protest and the public pressure eventually led to the opening of the archives in 2016. And to date, though it's a complicated step and very limited in scope, this was at least a step towards some kind of transparency. But while the influence of social media on the current social and political public sphere is no doubt substantial, the road to actually gaining a political achievement is a little more complex. And activists say that they ultimately needed the boost and sometimes even what they consider the authority of the mainstream media in order to generate more exposure and a greater influence. One activist told me this is the only way that we can bring the message to people outside of their echo chambers without investing large sums of money in advertising campaigns and so on. Yael Tzadok, also a former journalist and a noted activist, said that a show like Meet the Press that aired in 2017 and was devoted to the hearings of the commission to show all the problems with it, that it was really a great platform that social media can't provide. The show, she said, gave us a more exposure and a greater legitimacy because the public still sees TV programming and the press as more reliable. Tzadok further noted that while the mainstream media has been hostile to this affair for decades, their current dependency on social media for items, because now reporters are running to see what activists are writing on social media, it made them seek Yemenite activists, thus changing the power relation between citizens and traditional media gatekeepers. They couldn't ignore us anymore, she said. So in the end, my conclusion about what's happening in how influential the mainstream media is that, and I just want to quote, I don't know if any of you read Malcolm Gladwell in this context, and so I think a quote, and something that I've heard also from activists that are very aware that they need to translate the social media activism also to practical. And he said that sometimes it makes it easier for activists to express themselves, but harder for that expression to have any real impact. So in the end, I see the lack of real breakthrough as more of a testament to the strength of state systems rather than a weakness of social media. So, and what's important to understand is that in the absence of an honest discussion about the past, the same racist attitude continued to dictate the present and the future. The same racist attitude that likely led to these horrible acts are also motivating the years-long silencing and the rejection for a legitimate cry for answer. Both the government and the media legitimized this sentiment for too long. As Boaz Sanjero, a legal scholar who analyzed the last KEDMI commission, said that the last commission report didn't name any state agency or any authority figure responsible for separating hundreds of babies from their parents. And I quote him, throughout the report, the commission detailed a dry description of severe action without the slightest bit of criticism. In the whole entire report, the commission doesn't name even one person, flesh and blood, responsible, but blaming the parents, they did. And this issue of blaming the parents was already proven as a serious problem with what was called by psychology scholar Natalie Chaziza as a multi-generational trauma and prolonged, what she calls as prolonged grief. And for many families, it's the one thing that was still traumatizing to them. And I want to leave you, this is the closing sequence, it's just 1 minute, of a film, the only documentary film that was done about this by a colleague and a friend who unfortunately passed away, Tzipi Talmor, and it's called Down a One-Way Road. This has translations.
הדור השני, אנחנו הדור שנפגע, אומרים לנו שההורים שלכם נטשו את הילדים. لا تحسب أني زرقت وطا أني متقعقعت لرؤوت وطا أني لزرقت وطا أني ردفتي بني دققتي لجبعتين لكل مكان لما أنتني يروتا بعينتني
אני פונה לילד שלי כי זה לא אשמתי ולא אשמת אף אחד, זה אשמת הממונים, ולא כפי שאמרו שאנחנו לא התעניינו בילדים, זה שקר בהחלט. ולכן אני פונה אליך, חיים, מספר הזהות שלך 64703. נא עשה למען השם, תן לי מנוחה, שאני אדע שאתה חי איפה שאתה.
רק לומר שתי מילים, להגיד שלום, רק לשאול מה שלומך ומה איתך, מכאן עד שם, בצד האחר של הים.
Thank you, Shoshana, for a very moving and very powerful presentation. And although many of us have heard about the stories, I think the way you are dealing with the non-really investigation that is happening is another, I think, important element to the story. So we have two really amazing, I would say, segments of this very rich and very colorful and very diverse experience of Jews who came to Israel from Arab countries. And I'm sure there are questions. And as always, we would take the students first. So students, think of your questions. You're first. And yes, and just introduce yourself briefly. I think we need to, you have to speak into the mic because we're also, we are taping it, so people who might see it on video will hear you as well. Do they have to come in the front? Is that the idea, or can we, Zach, can you just go around with, can you take the mic off and go and give it to whoever? Perfect.
All right.
So the first.
Oh wait, I thought I was.
Is that okay? Okay.
First, I want to thank you, Professor Brenner, for your moderation in this, and I want to thank both of our guest speakers for their amazing and fascinating testimonies. Professor Kohlenberg, I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of the leadership in the Irgun and the Lechi, primarily with Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir. So when it came to leadership, what role did they play in the relationship between the leadership and the Mizrahi Jews? Was it more of the leadership recruiting the Mizrahim, or was it more of the Mizrahim coming to the leadership? If you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
No, just answer.
Sure, that's a great question. Thank you very much. I think it happens both ways. So, and it happens differently at different times. The late 1930s is different than the early 1940s. Particularly the leadership in the 1940s with the realization that there are fewer Jews coming from Europe because of World War II. They turned to Mizrahi Jews as a potential place to recruit. There's also the fact that they're looking actually specifically for non-affiliated revisionist Jews to fulfill the position, because those who are affiliated officially with revisionist Zionism are kind of seen as suspect by the British, so they're specifically turning toward Mizrahi Jews who aren't necessarily affiliated with revisionist Zionism. The Irgun and Lehi, and there's been some really good research on this, this is not my own original research, but are primarily recruiting from cities rather than in rural areas, and Mizrahim are concentrated in cities, and so they're more likely to recruit from those areas, and Mizrahim are more likely to know about the Irgun and Lehi. So I think it goes both ways. So that's on the side of the leadership, looking specifically to Mizrahi Jews as a potential source of participation. And then, as I mentioned, there was Mizrahi Jews who were specifically interested in these organizations for the reasons that I gave, the sort of social atmosphere, the ability to participate, certainly their belief in the revisionist Zionist ideas, the ideology. And there was one other thing I wanted to say, but now I'll forget it, so thank you.
Do you want to go over there? I think then you'll be also seen on that. And just briefly tell us your name and if you're a student, what you're studying.
Okay, hi, I'm Max. I'm here with my Voices of Modern Jewish Literature class. I am actually not a Jewish studies major or anything along those lines, but it is incredibly interesting. Thank you for talking, for starters. And I was just wondering, with these members of the Irgun and the Lehi, you talked a little bit on your one of your slides about terrorist versus freedom fighter. And I think a lot of this kind of stuff, a lot of people have this is more of a moral question than a scholarly question, I suppose. You grapple with acts like bringing a bomb into a prison being committed. Where do you find that you personally draw the line between, oh, this is someone who is fighting for, their freedom, and this is someone who is committing a heinous act?
That's a great question, and certainly one I think about a lot, and probably I'd love to not sort of be the one who says this is either terrorism or freedom fighting, but hear what you think and hear what others think. Generally in my scholarship, I define terrorism as acts committed against civilians, specifically targeting civilians. But I think that's the whole story about figures like Habshush, other members of the Irgun and Lehi would certainly say that they're participating in freedom fighting. Someone like Menachem Begin would say that. So too would Yasser Arafat say that a lot of the acts that he was participating in the PLO was freedom fighting. And he specifically talks about, for example, how he's considered a terrorist, but by the rest of the world, but he considers himself a freedom fighter. So I'm not really I really don't know. I mean, I think about it a lot. Was Habshush a terrorist or freedom fighter? I think she would say very much freedom fighter, but I'll leave you with that. The one thing that I wanted to just add, I did remember it, was on the question of recruiting, I mentioned that there was discrimination from the side of the general establishment towards Mizrahi Jews, and leaders of the Irgun and Lehi specifically kind of tapped into that. And they would say in newspapers, hey, the mainstream Zionists are discriminating against you. We won't discriminate against you. We see your value. Please come join us. So that was one other element that I wanted to get to. Thanks for both of the questions.
Yes. Yes. I guess it's possible to also move it around, yeah, but it's the camera.
Oh. Hello, my name's Sydney. I'm here today with the Jewish Literature Studies class. I have two questions. First question is for Professor Kahlberg. While Rachel was in prison, either awaiting her trial, during her trial, as well as afterwards during her imprisonment, were there any journalists who went to talk with her, interview her, and ask her to go into detail about why she made the decision to bring the bomb to the prison and to essentially blow up the Palestinian civilians? Because as you went into with your slides, you discussed how it was partially in response to what happened to her maternal grandfather in the 1929 raids of the Jewish settlement.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I haven't found any source where she specifically answers the question of why she did it. I think she, throughout her life, was proud of what she did. We do have a lot of press coverage in general about her act, but it's not usually dialoguing with her at the time. The only dialogue we have with her is in the 1960s. Generally, the press covers her in, I think, a really interesting way. Initially, they cover her as kind of this, always referencing her Yemeni status. They never talk about her being Moroccan as well. This sort of really hardcore Zionist. But later, when she's in prison, there's a lot of activists, specifically women activists, who say, we want to help get Rachel Habshush out of prison, including her mother, who writes, for example, to the High Commissioner of the British Mandate. And they portray her not as someone who had really strong beliefs, but actually someone who was kind of targeted, who was a victim of other forces, that she was just this pawn in a larger play, in a larger game, and she didn't really know what she was doing. She was just this poor girl. She was very young. There's a whole question about how old she actually was, if she was over 18 or younger than 18. And in the trial, it's interesting because if she was over 18, the British probably would have sentenced her to death. And if she was under 18, as was proven, she had life in prison. But there was actually no birth certificate, so there was a whole debate about how old she was. The point is, back to your question, I don't know if anyone actually journalists visited her in prison, but certainly a lot of people visited her in prison and said, she's this poor girl, she doesn't know what she did, she's just reacting to events from 1929.
Thank you. And my second question is Professor Gerber.
We have time.
Okay, Professor Gerber, what exactly made you interested and have you discovered the Jewish Yemenite baby abduction issue that happened throughout the 20th century? I've heard of it before when I went to Israel and went to talks in the Knesset of different people working there talking about the issue. None of them were from the committee, but it was mostly younger workers talking about Younger activists talking about the problem. I just want to know what got you interested in this and reporting on it.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And in general, I believe in talking about my subject position and kind of exposing that. So I grew up in a Yemenite family in Israel. I was born in Israel. Both my parents are from Yemen. And when I grew up, and I write about it, and I actually opened my book with that story, that I always heard from my father and several aunts about the abduction of my aunt's son when she arrived in the absorption camp in Rosh Hashanah. That was kind of a similar scenario to what Naomi is saying. And, my analysis of what happened to me when I heard it as a child is really in retrospect. But I think that I was also captured in the tales and the understanding of the Mizrahi community, like many people of my generation. I didn't want to necessarily be associated with Mizrahim, so I think I kind of filed that story as like either they don't understand what happened, I can't believe that this is what happened. I didn't believe them. So it really wasn't until, but I noted that I kept hearing about it, but it wasn't until I became a reporter. And at that point, I was a very different stage in my identity formation that I understood what had happened to me. But I remember working at a newspaper in Tel Aviv. It was called Iton Hapatish, the Hammer, and their slogan was the newspaper that will crack your head open. And I'll never forget this. We were sitting in an editorial meeting, and somebody said, does anybody know what happened with the kidnapped baby? And to me, it was all of a sudden somebody hit me with that metaphorical hammer. And I said, I'm going to look into it. And so that's when I started to investigate and to see what was going on with the commission. That's how I knew Rabbi Meshulam and kind of got involved in covering his protest and what was ultimately led to the Academy Commission.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes. Ephraim, would you also like to go there?
I am Ephraim Katzir, the director of Sephardic Heritage International, or SHIN-DC. And a question and a comment. The question is, we refer to people from Middle East and North Africa as Mizrahi Jews. And did any of those people ever refer to themselves as Mizrahi before 1948? And if not, which I believe is the answer, why is it important today to refer to them as such? Because there may be some benefit in doing so. And my comment is, when we speak of Zionism and the development of Zionism, we speak of European Zionism. But what about Zionism within the Sephardic community, for example? Rabbi Yisrael Najara, the rabbi of Gaza in the 16th century, wrote a very Zionist poem that people still sing today. Or Rabbi Yehuda ben Shlomo Alkalai, some call the father of religious Zionism. Or Ben Zion Avraham Cuenca, who was one of the rabbis in Jerusalem in around 1880. And he said, when he wrote his halakhic journal, Hama'asif, he said, he published it by the spirit of love for Artzenu HaKedosha, our holy land, which is engraved inside every Ish Israel, every Jew, and every single Sephardic rabbi signed the halakhic journal. And he also said, one of our essential goals will be to deliver and present the foundations in the halakha, or the rabbinic law, in all the issues and rulings that relate to the settlement, Yeshuv, or Yeshuv Aretz, or the settlement of the land. So how do we take that
I think we
into
got,
account?
thank you, we got the question. It may relate more to the second session than to these two lectures. I don't know, Tzvi, is this something you will address in your lecture a little bit, but maybe you want to? Sure. Actually, if you don't mind, it's easier from there, just for the viewers online.
Very, very briefly, I'm not going to address the question of the Sephardic rabbis, Najara, Alkalai. We can debate that forever. You have a point that they might relate into a history of Zionism, but this is a history of Zionism that we write backwards. Okay, and we can go back to Moshe Rabbeinu on that one. With the question of self-identification as Mizrahim, I was myself surprised to discover that at least as early as the 1920s, some intellectuals, particularly one that I won't have time to mention today, Chaim Ben Kiki, did talk about the communities in North Africa and the Middle East as Mizrahim, Easterners specifically, not as Azdot HaMizrach, but specifically as Mizrahim. And in his case, it's more significant because he was a Maghrebi. In other words, he was Moroccan, but he was still using the category Orient. Yeah. And I'll give you the reference later.
Thank you. I think we'll probably go on with this topic. But of course, that is one of the reasons why if you look at the title of the conference, we very deliberately didn't choose one. We said, one very disputed term some people use, other people don't like, is Arab Jews, Jews of Islam, Mizrahim or Sephardim. All are problematic, actually, if you look at them closely. If I just may finish. Sephardic Jews, of course, is also not correct for every Jew in Yemen or Jews from parts of North Africa or Jews from Iraq. Some of them have not more to do with Sepharad than a Jew in Poland. The same is true, Europe versus Jews. There were Sephardic Jews, of course, from Salonika, from Bulgaria, and not all European Jews are Ashkenazi. So it is a very, very complex issue. If we are correct, we should probably speak of Moroccan Jews and Yemenite Jews and Libyan Jews and so on. But we all look for categories, and sometimes it is just, the West and the rest, exactly. So it's Ashkenazim, and everyone else is whatever you call it, Mizrahi, and that's not correct. But you're absolutely right.
Sephardic Jews are just as underrepresented as Mizrahi Jews, so what's the point of separating them? Even when it to dealing with underrepresentation.
I can talk to you about it.
Yeah. So we will talk more about it. But let me just ask. We have, if there is, yes. Could you want to go to the last question to our speakers?
Well, hi, my name is Julian Weiss. I'm unfortunately not in Lauren Strauss's Jewish literature class, but I am in her History of Israel class, or Israeli American Jewish history. All right, and I have a few questions, but I guess we only have time for one.
Do it one, yes.
All right.
The
So I'm
best.
curious for Miss Madame Lee Gerber. So, Mizrahim in Israel, which, I mean, I guess it's a questionable way to describe it, but Mizrahim generally tend to vote for right-wing parties. And I was wondering if being that a Labor government was in power during the Yemeni Children's Affair, if this has had any effect on that, especially in the Yemeni community specifically.
It's a good question, because I remember that I was directing it to one of the researchers when I was covering this issue, and I was saying, well, Labor Party was in charge. How come Likud didn't do everything to expose it? So I think I alluded to it during my talk, and I said that it deconstructs the Zionist narrative. It's a very problematic story to deal with, because how can we justify treating other Jewish people and any human being, but let alone other brothers and sisters, in this way? It's something that is very difficult to justify. And I still remember the answer that I got back then, which was, the problem with investigation is that you only know where it starts. If you really want to investigate, you have no idea how deep it goes and how wide it develops. And to my knowledge, it was something that was involved everybody. True that the Labor Party was in charge, but everybody was involved. There's some, links to a rabbi in the United States that was likely behaving as a broker or a seller of children here in the United States. So many of these lines of investigations were actually never advanced. They started, they showed some incriminating evidence, and they were never really materialized. And maybe in this context, that one thing that I said in my work, what's important to me more than categories is to stress and actually that relates also, Caroline, to your work, because at the same time, the Zionism used the Arabness of the different categories of Jews that arrived against them. At the same time, with the discourse of hygiene, with everything that I've mentioned here, but also when it comes to defense purposes, their Arabness is used to recruit them because they are Palestinian passing, which is really very effective when you want to send spies. And I don't know how many of you watch the popular show Fauda, right? So it's never is what's really bothering me. One of the things about this show is that they never address the fact that all the Mistarevim, all the soldiers that are there, that they're all Mizrahim. The creator is Iraqi. Okay, there is a reason why they're fluent in Arabic and why they look the way they look. So again, at the same time, this dichotomy that no one wanted to deal with, because the Likud is also Ashkenazi dominance. Okay?
Karen, maybe you also want to address that question because it relates to you.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question and certainly something that sociologists think about a lot, which is why in the last 30, 40, 50 even years, Mizrahi Jews have largely voted for right-wing parties. Not all by any means, of course. I would say, interestingly, maybe some of us know that figures like Menachem Begin, who was elected in 1977, was someone who oftentimes invoked the participation of Mizrahi, Middle Eastern, whatever we want to say, Jews in the underground pre-1948 to show that they were very much a part of Zionism, that they were as much a part of Zionism as Ashkenazi Jews. And he would say that kind of thing, perhaps when courting a Mizrahi general vote. So I think certainly in the minds of many Likud leaders, the Mizrahi involvement pre-1948 was relevant in the post-state period to show they were just as patriotic or just as part of Zionism.
I wanted to add one more thing, because voting is not only a political act, it's also you're motivated by other emotions. And I just want to, I can't stress this enough. When you look at representation, when I look at the press, to me it was really important that I was part of the press before I actually studied it, is that I could see it firsthand. All 90% of the editors, owners, reporters were all Ashkenazi, and their disdain towards Mizrahim, and even in places, and that's why I said when I talked about Haaretz that had some islands of really good coverage in the mid-90s, even that paper, and that I know some people consider it the New York Times of Israel, I don't agree, but it has some very problematic issues, because when the last commission's report came out, their title was exhaustive investigation. Even though they did all this, and when I interviewed the magazine editor, and I asked him, and he's, by the way, was different because he was with Matzpen, and he acknowledged all this. He said, listen, they felt when we published the series of articles, they felt that we're working against their parents' generation. So I think this is even a bigger question than why Likud didn't do it. Why the white left that is liberal and progressive didn't do anything about it. And he said they just didn't like it. And even when in Rosh Ain, which is a major Yemeni town, they called and asked for more newspapers because all of a sudden the word got out, Haaretz is doing these articles, they refused to send more papers, which is unheard of. What newspaper would refuse more circulation? And he said they just didn't want to be the Yemeni newspaper. So that's how deep it goes.
I cannot end without asking you, we heard from that older Yemenite gentleman, and I don't know if his son or anyone responded to it. Did parents find their children again?
Yes, some. I mean, David Shuker is one case that we documented in this because the show's producer and they wanted to see this one example of an adoptive mother and a biological parent. So we documented one case. We have some children that came forward, but there were no, it's very difficult because even if you think about a number like 2,000, if they're around the world, it's like finding a needle in a haystack. So that's not, I know that it feels like we want to see mothers and children, but that is not that picture. And what he did here in this closing sequence of the film is something that he just had the urge. I know him, I've interviewed him several times, and he had the urge to all of a sudden, he was like speaking to his child. His name is Shlomo Baagali, and he passed away already, but he did not find his child.
We went a little bit over time, but it was really fascinating. We'll have 15 minutes coffee break. We'll start just a few minutes later.